In 1898, 14 years before the Titanic sank, a writer named Morgan Robertson published a novella called Futility about an unsinkable British luxury liner called the Titan, the largest ship afloat, with insufficient lifeboats carrying wealthy passengers, that strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic in April and sinks with massive loss of life because there aren't enough lifeboats. The similarities are so eerie that conspiracy theorists claim Robertson had supernatural knowledge. But Robertson wasn't a woman, and he wasn't even the most disturbing predictor of the Titanic disaster. That distinction might belong to spiritualist medium Madame V. Newberry, who in 1909 claimed to receive a vision of a great ship sinking in ice with massive loss of life and warned about it publicly, or to the multiple women who reported premonitions in dreams, warning them not to board the ship and who canceled their passages at the last minute, or perhaps to the crew members' wives who begged their husbands not to sail on the Titanic's maiden voyage because they had terrible feelings about it, or maybe even to Mother Shipton, a 16th century prophetess whose prophecies were claimed to have predicted the Titanic centuries before it was built. But here's what makes this story genuinely disturbing rather than just supernatural curiosity. The Titanic received at least 6 clear, specific, scientifically accurate warnings about ice directly ahead on the night it sank, transmitted via the modern miracle of wireless telegraph from other ships in the area. And these warnings were either ignored, not passed to the bridge, or dismissed as unimportant because everyone knew the Titanic was unsinkable. The real predictions of the Titanic disaster weren't supernatural visions, but rather urgent messages from nearby ships saying, "There is ice exactly where you're headed," that were treated as background noise rather than critical safety information. The disaster wasn't unpredictable. It was predicted repeatedly by people with accurate information, and then happened anyway because the predictions were ignored in favor of faith in technology and schedule. Welcome to History Unleashed, where we explore the stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature. I'm your host, and today we're investigating the predictions, warnings, and premonitions surrounding the Titanic disaster, where we'll discover the eerie coincidences and supposed supernatural predictions that emerged before and after the sinking, explore the very real scientific warnings the ship received that were ignored, examine why people claim premonitions about disasters and how confirmation bias shapes these stories, investigate the culture of technological hubris that made ignoring warnings seem reasonable, and understand what the Titanic's ignored warnings teach us about how humans respond to risk, authority, and technological overconfidence. If you're ready to discover that multiple passengers reported premonitions and canceled their tickets, that the ship's wireless operators were too busy sending passengers personal messages to prioritize ice warnings, that Captain Smith had ignored ice warnings on previous voyages without incident, reinforcing his belief that modern ships could handle ice fields safely, and that the unsinkable marketing created a psychological environment where warnings seemed unnecessary because the ship supposedly couldn't sink anyway. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we're about to explore combines supernatural mystery with the very mundane reality of organizational failure and human overconfidence. So prepare yourself for a journey into predictions and warnings, where we'll separate eerie coincidence from genuine foresight, where supernatural claims meet scientific reality, and where the real lesson is that the disaster was predicted by science and happened anyway, because humans are remarkably good at ignoring warnings that contradict what they want to believe. Chapter 1. The Premonitions, Dreams, Visions, and Canceled Passages. The folklore surrounding the Titanic includes dozens of stories about people who had premonitions, dreams, or terrible feelings that led them to cancel their passages on the ship's maiden voyage. And while many of these accounts are likely exaggerated, fabricated after the fact, or examples of confirmation bias where we remember the warnings that came true while forgetting thousands of false alarms, some of these stories are documented in sources from before the disaster and represent genuinely strange coincidences that continue to fascinate anyone interested in whether humans can somehow sense future disasters. Whether these represent genuine precognition, lucky intuition, or simply the statistical inevitability that some people will have bad feelings about any given ship and some of those people will be proven right when disaster strikes remains one of the enduring mysteries of the Titanic story. The most famous cancellation was that of J.P. Morgan, the American financier who owned the White Star Line through his International Mercantile Marine Company, who had a suite reserved on the Titanic's maiden voyage but canceled at the last minute, officially due to business commitments in Europe. Morgan's cancellation has fueled conspiracy theories suggesting he knew something would happen. But the timing and documented reasons make this unlikely. Morgan had legitimate business reasons to stay in Europe, and if he'd really known the ship would sink, he presumably would have warned others or canceled the voyage entirely, rather than just protecting himself. Still the richest man in America not sailing on his own. Company's greatest ship on its maiden voyage remains an interesting coincidence. Several prominent passengers reported dreams or premonitions before the voyage. Mrs. Blanche Marshall, who was booked on the Titanic, reported having a recurring nightmare about floating wreckage and drowning people, which disturbed her enough that she convinced her husband to cancel their passage and sail on a different ship. Her story is documented in sources from shortly after the disaster, making it harder to dismiss as post hoc fabrication. Whether this was genuine precognition, anxiety about ocean travel manifesting as nightmares, or simply one of many passengers who had bad dreams that only became significant after the disaster is unclear. J. Pierpont Morgan's former business partner, Henry Clay Frick, was also booked on the Titanic but canceled when his wife injured her ankle, forcing them to delay their return to America. Frick later said his wife's injury saved their lives, but again, this was coincidence rather than premonition. The injury was real, and the timing was unfortunate, or in this case, fortunate. The number of wealthy Americans who canceled Titanic passages for various reasons, and then survived, has fueled speculation about whether the elite knew something, but the simpler explanation is that wealthy people frequently changed their travel plans, and most who canceled did so for mundane reasons. The spiritualist community produced several claimed predictions, though most are difficult to verify. Madame V. Newberry, a New York medium, claimed to have received a vision in 1909, 3 years before the disaster, of a great ocean liner sinking in ice with massive loss of life. She supposedly shared this vision with others at the time, and some sources suggest she tried to warn the White Star Line, though documentation of these pre-disaster warnings is sparse. The problem with evaluating spiritualist predictions is that spiritualists were constantly making predictions about disasters, most of which never happened, so the statistical likelihood that one would eventually be proven right is high. Several crew members' wives and family members reportedly begged their husbands not to sail on the Titanic. Mrs. Bessie Witter reported that her husband, ship's greaser Alfred Witter, told her she had nightmares about him drowning before he left for the Titanic's maiden voyage. She begged him not to go, but he needed the work and sailed anyway, surviving the disaster. Stories like this are complicated by the fact that sailors' wives and families often worried about voyages, so some amount of anxiety before any ship departure was normal. The question is whether the anxiety about the Titanic was genuinely unusual, or whether we only remember it because the disaster gave significance to otherwise routine worried goodbyes. The case of Reverend Carter, an American Methodist minister, provides one of the more intriguing documented premonitions. Carter was booked on the Titanic but reported having a disturbing dream in which he saw the ship sinking and people drowning. The dream was vivid enough that he discussed it with family members before the voyage, and these discussions were documented in sources shortly after the disaster. Carter changed his passage to a different ship based on the dream, explicitly telling people it was because of the nightmare. This is harder to dismiss as post hoc fabrication, because the dream and his response were documented before the sinking. Colin MacDonald, a Scottish traveler booked on the Titanic, reportedly sent a telegram to his sister saying, "Feel nervous about this ship. Something tells me it will never reach New York." MacDonald did sail on the Titanic and died in the disaster, but his telegram was preserved and documented. Whether this represented genuine intuition, normal travel anxiety that became significant after the disaster, or possibly even a joking message taken seriously after his death is unclear. The telegram's existence before the disaster makes it harder to dismiss entirely. The problem with evaluating all these premonition stories is the selection bias and confirmation bias inherent in how we remember disasters. Thousands of people boarded the Titanic without reporting any premonitions, Many people probably had bad dreams or anxious feelings but sailed anyway and survived or died regardless. If the ship had completed its maiden voyage successfully, none of these stories would have seemed significant. Nervous passengers change their plans all the time, and most of the time, nothing happens. We only remember the warnings that came true while forgetting the vastly larger number of false alarms. The psychological phenomenon of disaster premonitions is well documented but poorly understood. Before major disasters, some people consistently report dreams, intuitions, or anxious feelings that they later interpret as having predicted the disaster. Whether this represents genuine precognition, heightened anxiety in people who pick up on subtle environmental or social cues suggesting danger, or simply the statistical inevitability that some people will have bad feelings that occasionally coincide with actual disasters, remains debated. The scientific consensus tends toward the statistical and psychological explanations rather than supernatural precognition. The cultural fascination with Titanic premonitions reflects both our desire to find meaning in tragedy and our hope that disasters might be avoidable if we pay attention to warnings. If people really can sense future disasters through premonitions, then maybe we can prevent tragedies by taking such warnings seriously. But if premonitions are just anxiety and coincidence, then focusing on them distracts from the real warnings, scientific, concrete, and actionable, that were ignored in the Titanic case. The supernatural angle is more emotionally satisfying than the mundane reality that the disaster resulted from organizational failures and ignored scientific warnings. The after-the-fact fabrications and exaggerations also complicate evaluating these stories. After any major disaster, people emerge claiming to have predicted it, had premonitions about it, or warned against it. Some of these claims are sincere but incorrectly remembered. Memory is reconstructive, and people can genuinely believe they had premonitions they didn't actually have. Others are deliberate fabrications by attention seekers or spiritualists promoting their abilities. Separating genuine pre-disaster documented warnings from post-disaster fabrications requires careful evaluation of sources and timing. The most credible premonition stories involve people who documented their feelings before the disaster, changed their behavior based on those feelings, and whose contemporaries can confirm the timeline. Reverend Carter's documented dream and ticket change, Mrs. Marshall's nightmares leading to cancellation, and a few other cases meet this standard. But even these could be coincidence. Enough people have bad feelings about travel that some will occasionally be vindicated by actual disasters. The question isn't whether any documented premonitions exist, but whether they represent anything beyond normal anxiety, coincidentally proven right. From which country are you watching this? Because the fascination with disaster premonitions exists across cultures and reflects universal human desires to find patterns, believe we can sense danger, and hope that tragedies are avoidable if we pay attention to warnings. What disaster premonition stories from your culture seem most credible versus most likely fabricated? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're intrigued by these supernatural claims, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to explore the fictional predictions of the Titanic that eerily matched reality. Or did they? Geek Hour Chapter 2, Futility and Fiction. The Eerie Predictions in Literature. The most famous prediction of the Titanic disaster appears in fiction rather than premonitions, visions, or supernatural warnings. Morgan Robertson's 1898 novella Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan, describes the maiden voyage disaster of a British luxury liner with so many similarities to the actual Titanic that conspiracy theorists, spiritualists, and people who love eerie coincidences have pointed to it for over a century as evidence of either Robertson's supernatural foresight, some form of precognition bleeding through into fiction, or at minimum, one of history's most disturbing coincidences. But when we examine Robertson's story carefully alongside other maritime fiction, from the period and the actual state of shipbuilding technology in the 1890s, the prediction starts looking less like supernatural knowledge and more like informed extrapolation from existing trends, combined with a healthy dose of confirmation bias about which details actually matched and which didn't. Morgan Robertson's Futility tells the story of the Titan, the largest and most luxurious ship afloat, proclaimed unsinkable by its designers and operators, carrying wealthy passengers across the North Atlantic in April, when it strikes an iceberg on the starboard side and sinks with massive loss of life because there are insufficient lifeboats for the passengers aboard. The parallels to the Titanic are undeniably striking. Both ships have similar names. Both are British luxury liners. Both are considered unsinkable. Both are the largest ships of their time. Both sink in April in the North Atlantic after hitting icebergs. Both have insufficient lifeboats causing massive casualties. And both carry wealthy, complacent passengers who believe themselves safe due to modern technology. The specific statistical similarities are often exaggerated but remain eerie. The Titan was 800 feet long while the Titanic was 882 feet. The Titan could carry about 3,000 people, while the Titanic could carry about 3,500. The Titan had 24 lifeboats while the Titanic had 20. Both ships hit the iceberg on the starboard side. Both ships were traveling too fast through ice fields. Both disasters resulted from hubris and overconfidence in technology. These similarities are striking enough that Robertson's story has become legendary as a seemingly impossible prediction of events 14 years in the future. But let's examine the context and the ways the prediction wasn't as supernatural as it appears. First, Robertson was a former merchant seaman who understood ships and maritime trends. In the 1890s, the trend in shipbuilding was obviously toward larger, faster, more luxurious vessels. The arms race between shipping lines to build bigger ships was already underway. Robertson simply extrapolated that trend to its logical conclusion. Someone would build the biggest ship possible and market it as unsinkable. This wasn't supernatural foresight, but informed speculation about where the industry was headed. Second, the name Titan wasn't a miraculous prediction, but rather an obvious choice for the largest ship imaginable. Titans being mythological giants, making Titan the natural name for a gigantic ship. Titanic comes from the same mythological root for the same reason. Both Robertson and the White Star Line independently chose mythologically gigantic names for ships intended to be the largest afloat. The similarity is coincidence based on both parties having the same cultural references and the same naming logic. Third, the April North Atlantic iceberg collision wasn't unlikely or specifically predicted. It was known maritime danger. The North Atlantic shipping lanes passed through areas with icebergs, particularly in spring when ice broke off from Greenland and drifted south. Ships colliding with icebergs was not only possible but had happened numerous times. Robertson set his fictional disaster in the place and time where ship-iceberg collisions were most likely. He was writing a realistic maritime disaster story, not predicting a specific future event. Fourth, the insufficient lifeboats weren't supernatural foresight, but criticism of existing maritime safety regulations. In the 1890s, ships were already being built larger than the regulations required lifeboats for. Because lifeboat regulations were based on ship tonnage using outdated formulas that didn't account for modern ship capacity. Robertson was commenting on this known safety problem, not predicting that a specific future ship would have insufficient lifeboats. He was criticizing a regulatory failure that already existed. Fifth, the unsinkable claim wasn't unique to either the Titan or Titanic, but was common marketing language for modern ships with watertight compartments. Multiple ships in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were marketed as practically unsinkable or unsinkable based on their watertight compartment designs. Robertson was satirizing this hubristic marketing, not predicting that a specific future ship would be marketed this way. The hubris he was criticizing was already widespread. The differences between futility and the real Titanic disaster are also significant, but often ignored by people emphasizing the eerie similarities. Robertson's Titan had 3 propellers while the Titanic had 3. Robertson's Titan carried 3,000 passengers and crew, while the actual Titanic carried about 2,200 on its maiden voyage. Robertson's ship sank quickly and violently while the Titanic took over 2.5 hours to sink, giving time for evacuation attempts. The details of the disasters are quite different despite the broad similarity of large ship hits iceberg and sinks with insufficient lifeboats. Robertson himself didn't claim any supernatural prediction or foresight. After the Titanic sank, people pointed out the similarities between his fiction and reality, and Robertson acknowledged them but attributed them to his knowledge of maritime trends and dangers, rather than to any precognitive ability. He'd written a realistic maritime disaster story based on known technology, known dangers, and his professional experience. That real events later resembled his fiction was coincidence based on both flowing from the same underlying realities of shipbuilding and North Atlantic navigation. The other literary prediction often cited is W.T. Stead's 1886 short story, How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic, and his 1892 story, From the Old World to the New, both of which involve ships sinking in the North Atlantic with insufficient lifeboats and massive loss of life. Stead makes the eerie list of predictions because he actually sailed on the Titanic's maiden voyage and died in the disaster, creating a seemingly impossible coincidence where a man who wrote about ship disasters then died in one. But again, context matters. Stead was a journalist who wrote about many topics, including maritime safety. His stories reflected known dangers rather than supernatural knowledge, and ship disasters were common enough that multiple writers addressed them. That Stead later died in a real ship disaster is tragic irony, rather than evidence of precognition. The selection bias in how we remember these fictional predictions is important. Many authors wrote maritime disaster stories in the late 19th and early 20th centuries because ship sinking was a real danger and dramatic subject matter. Most of these stories didn't resemble any specific future disaster and are forgotten. We remember Robertson instead because their fiction happened to resemble a famous real disaster, while ignoring the many authors whose disaster fiction didn't match any real events. This is survivorship bias. We notice the hits and ignore the misses. The psychological appeal of literary predictions reflects our desire to find hidden meaning and our tendency to see patterns even in coincidence. The idea that an author somehow knew about a future disaster through supernatural means or unconscious precognition is more exciting than the mundane reality that he wrote a realistic story based on known trends and dangers that later came true because the underlying conditions hadn't changed. We prefer mystical explanations to mundane ones even when the mundane explanations are more plausible. The broader lesson is about informed prediction versus supernatural foresight. Robertson made an informed prediction based on his expertise. Large ships were getting bigger. Marketing was becoming more hubristic. Regulations weren't keeping pace with technology, and icebergs were known dangers. His prediction was really extrapolation. The fact that real events later matched his extrapolation suggests his analysis was accurate, not that he had supernatural knowledge. This is an important distinction. Expert-informed prediction based on trend analysis is valuable and should be taken seriously, while supernatural claims are usually either coincidence or pattern-seeking and randomness. From which country are you watching this? Because the distinction between informed prediction and supernatural foresight is relevant across all areas of life. Experts who warn about future problems based on current trends should be taken seriously, even when their warnings sound like disaster predictions. What examples from your country show experts' warnings being dismissed as alarmism before coming true? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're struck by how Robertson's informed prediction was simultaneously accurate and unremarkable, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to explore the real predictions of the Titanic disaster, the scientific warnings that were actually ignored. Chapter 3. The Real Warnings. Ice messages that were ignored. While supernatural premonitions and eerie literary coincidences capture popular imagination, the genuinely disturbing predictions of the Titanic disaster were neither supernatural nor coincidental, but were concrete, scientific, specific warnings transmitted via wireless telegraph from multiple ships in the area, warning about the exact danger that ultimately sank the ship, ice in the North Atlantic directly in Titanic's path. The ship received at least 6 separate ice warnings on April 14, 1912, the day it sank, with increasing specificity about the location of ice fields and bergs, transmitted by wireless operators on other ships using the modern miracle of radio communication, specifically to warn vessels about hazards ahead. These warnings were either never passed to the captain and officers on the bridge, were passed but not acted upon, or were acknowledged but not considered serious enough to warrant slowing down or changing course. The Titanic disaster wasn't unpredictable. It was explicitly predicted by people with accurate information, and then happened anyway because organizational failures, hubris, and competing priorities caused those warnings to be ignored or minimized. The first ice warning came at 9:00 a.m. on April 14th from the Caronia, reporting bergs, growlers, and field ice in a specific latitude and longitude near Titanic's planned route. This message was delivered to the bridge and acknowledged by Captain Smith, who posted it for his officers to read. The warning was clear and specific, but didn't immediately affect Titanic's operations because the reported ice was still hours ahead, and standard practice was to rely on lookouts to spot ice in time to avoid it. Captain Smith acknowledged the warning but didn't reduce speed or alter course. The second warning came at 1:42 p.m. from the Baltic, reporting Greek steamer Atheniae reports passing icebergs and large quantities of field ice, in a position even closer to Titanic's route. This message was delivered to Captain Smith on the bridge, but Smith apparently handed it to J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line managing director who was aboard for the maiden voyage, rather than immediately acting on it or ensuring it was posted for other officers. The warning was more specific and closer to Titanic's path, but still didn't prompt speed, reduction, or course change. The third warning came at 1:45 p.m. from the America via the Titanic's wireless operators, reporting America passed 2 large icebergs at a specific position. This warning was received by the wireless operators but apparently wasn't passed to the bridge at all because the wireless operators were busy handling a backlog of passenger messages. Wealthy passengers sending personal telegrams to shore and didn't prioritize the navigational warning. The wireless system was operated commercially for passenger profit rather than primarily for ship safety, creating a situation where commercial messages took priority over safety warnings. The fourth warning came at 5:50 p.m. from the nearby ship Rappahannock, not by wireless but by visual signal lamp as the ships passed each other. The Rappahannock signaled that it had just come through heavy ice and warned Titanic about it. This warning was received on Titanic's bridge and acknowledged, but again didn't prompt speed reduction. The officers apparently considered lookouts and standard navigation procedures sufficient for dealing with ice, assuming they would see bergs in time to avoid them. The fifth warning came at 7:30 p.m. from the Californian reporting 3 large bergs at a specific position near Titanic's route. This message was also apparently not passed to the bridge, with wireless operator Jack Phillips being busy with passenger messages and not recognizing the navigational importance of the ice warning. The commercial pressure to handle paying passengers' telegrams took priority over the safety information that should have been immediately forwarded to ship's officers. The sixth and final warning came at 10:30 p.m. from the Californian, now stopped in ice fields and trying to warn nearby ships. The Californian's wireless operator attempted to warn Titanic that they were stopped and surrounded by ice, but Jack Phillips on the Titanic, still working through the backlog of commercial messages and irritated by the interruption, cut off the Californian with "Shut up. Shut up, I'm busy." Phillips was within his technical rights. The Californian's powerful wireless transmission was interfering with his ability to send messages to a shore station. But his response meant that the most urgent warning, from a ship stopped in ice fields within sight of where Titanic was headed, was never delivered. At 11:40 p.m., less than 90 minutes after dismissing the Californian's warning, Titanic's lookout spotted an iceberg directly ahead. By then it was too late to avoid collision, and the ship struck the iceberg on the starboard side, breaching 5 forward compartments and ensuring the ship would sink. The disaster that had been predicted multiple times that day, with increasing urgency and specificity, occurred exactly as warned. The ship was traveling at near maximum speed through an ice field that multiple ships had reported, hitting an iceberg that could have been avoided if the warnings had been taken seriously enough to warrant speed reduction or course change. The reasons why these warnings were ignored reveal multiple organizational and cultural failures. First, the wireless system's commercial operation created split priorities. Wireless operators were employees of the Marconi Company, rather than the ship's crew, paid primarily to handle commercial traffic-generating revenue, creating incentive to prioritize paying passengers' personal messages over navigational warnings. The system wasn't designed primarily for safety but for profit, and the operators acted accordingly. Second, the protocol for handling ice warnings was apparently informal and inconsistent. Some warnings were passed to the bridge immediately, some were delivered when convenient, and some weren't passed at all. There was no clear system ensuring that navigational warnings reached responsible officers immediately. The wireless operators had discretion about what to forward and when, and they apparently didn't understand or prioritize the safety importance of ice warnings over commercial message traffic. Third, Captain Smith and the bridge officers apparently didn't consider the warning serious enough to warrant reducing speed or significantly altering course. this wasn't unique to the Titanic. Standard practice in the North Atlantic at the time was to maintain speed through ice regions and rely on lookouts to spot icebergs in time to avoid them. This practice worked most of the time, reinforcing the belief that it was adequate. Smith had decades of experience crossing the North Atlantic and had previously navigated through ice fields without incident, giving him confidence that standard procedures were sufficient. Fourth, the competitive pressure to maintain speed on the maiden voyage influenced decision-making. The Titanic was trying to arrive in New York on schedule, and White Star Line managing director Bruce Ismay was aboard, creating pressure to demonstrate the ship's speed and capability. Slowing down for ice would mean arriving late and would undermine the image of power and speed the maiden voyage was meant to project. The commercial and reputational incentives pushed toward maintaining speed despite warnings. Fifth, the unsinkable belief created complacency about dangers. If the ship truly was unsinkable due to its watertight compartments and modern design, then ice was merely a navigation hazard to be avoided, if convenient, but not a mortal threat requiring extreme caution. The marketing and genuine belief in the ship's invulnerability reduced the perceived stakes of encountering ice, making warnings seem less urgent. Why slow down for ice if hitting ice wouldn't sink you anyway? Sixth, the moonless night conditions made ice extremely difficult to see. The warnings should have prompted extra caution because visibility was poor. Calm seas without waves breaking against icebergs, no moon providing illumination, and black ice difficult to distinguish from dark water. Under these conditions, the warnings should have been taken even more seriously because the standard procedure of relying on lookouts to spot ice was compromised by visibility. But the connection between poor visibility and increased danger from reported ice wasn't apparently made, or didn't overcome the pressure to maintain speed. The comparison to modern aviation is instructive. Modern aircraft receive weather warnings, navigational alerts, and traffic warnings through multiple redundant systems, with clear protocols requiring immediate action on safety warnings. Commercial considerations are subordinated to safety. Warnings are prioritized over non-essential communications. The lessons learned from disasters like the Titanic, that safety information must take absolute priority over commercial considerations, are built into modern transportation safety culture. The Titanic sank partly because these lessons hadn't been learned yet. The wireless operator's situation was particularly tragic. Jack Phillips, who dismissed the Californian's final warning, died in the sinking. He was doing his job as he understood it, handling commercial traffic efficiently, and didn't realize that the navigation warning he dismissed was describing ice that would sink the ship within the hour. His decision to prioritize commercial messages over the warning wasn't malicious or even necessarily wrong by the standards of his employment, but it contributed to disaster. The systemic problem was that his priorities were set by commercial rather than safety considerations. The Californian's role makes the tragedy worse. The ship that sent the final warning was stopped in ice fields within sight of where the Titanic would hit the iceberg. If Phillips had accepted the warning and passed it to the bridge, if the Titanic had slowed or stopped, if the bridge officers had contacted the Californian for more information about ice conditions, the disaster might have been avoided. Instead, the Californian's wireless operator, rebuffed by Titanic, turned off his equipment and went to bed, meaning that when Titanic sent distress signals starting at 12:15 a.m., the nearest ship didn't receive them because its wireless operator was sleeping. The post-disaster reforms included regulations requiring 24-hour wireless watch, prioritization of safety messages over commercial traffic, and clear protocols for handling navigational warnings. These reforms explicitly addressed the failures that allowed Titanic's warnings to be ignored. The International Ice Patrol was established to monitor icebergs and warn ships, institutionalizing the warning system that had existed informally through ship-to-ship messages, but had failed in the Titanic case. From which country are you watching this? Because the Titanic's ignored warnings show patterns that repeat across disasters. Experts warning about specific dangers, those warnings being dismissed due to competing priorities or overconfidence, and disaster happening exactly as predicted because the warnings weren't heeded. What disasters in your country occurred despite explicit warnings that were ignored? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're struck by how preventable the Titanic disaster was, Make sure you're subscribed because we're about to explore the culture of technological hubris that made ignoring warnings seem reasonable. Chapter 4. The Unsinkable Myth. Hubris and Technological Overconfidence. The Titanic disaster occurred not because of inadequate technology, but because of excessive confidence in technology. The ship's advanced design with watertight compartments, powerful engines, sophisticated navigation equipment, and modern wireless communications created a cultural environment where the dangers of nature seemed conquered, where icebergs were viewed as mere navigation hazards rather than mortal threats, and where warnings could be dismissed because everyone knew that modern ships were practically unsinkable, and that even if a collision occurred, the ship would remain afloat long enough for help to arrive. This hubris wasn't unique to the Titanic, but reflected broader Edwardian cultural attitudes where industrial and technological progress seemed to have made humanity master over nature, where every year brought bigger, faster, more impressive engineering achievements, and where the idea that natural dangers still posed serious threats seemed old-fashioned and pessimistic. Understanding this culture of technological overconfidence is essential for understanding why intelligent, experienced people dismissed clear warnings about dangers ahead. The unsinkable myth needs careful examination because it's simultaneously been exaggerated and was genuinely influential. The claim that the Titanic was marketed as literally unsinkable isn't quite accurate. White Star Line was more careful in their language, describing the ship as practically unsinkable, or designed to be unsinkable rather than making absolute claims. But the practical effect was the same. Passengers, crew, investors, and the public believed the ship was as close to unsinkable as engineering could make it. The distinction between technically, we said, practically unsinkable, and everyone understood us to mean it can't sink is lawyerly rather than meaningful. The basis for the unsinkable claim was the ship's watertight compartment system. The Titanic's hull was divided into 16 compartments by 15 watertight bulkheads that could be closed to isolate damaged sections. The ship was designed to remain afloat even if 2 compartments flooded, or even if the first 4 compartments flooded, which designers considered the worst plausible damage from any realistic collision. This was sophisticated engineering based on sound principles. The problem was that the iceberg breach extended across 5 compartments, damaging more sections than the designers had considered possible. The engineering wasn't flawed, but the assumptions about worst-case scenarios were too optimistic. The watertight compartments weren't actually watertight to the top. The bulkheads only extended a certain height above the waterline, meaning that if the ship tilted or sank low enough, water could spill over from one compartment into the next. This was a known design limitation accepted because extending bulkheads to the full height of the ship would have been impractical and expensive. The designers assumed that the flooding would be controlled before the ship tilted enough for water to spill over. But once 5 compartments flooded and the ship began sinking by the bow, water progressively spilled from one compartment into the next, defeating the watertight system. The design worked as intended, but the damage exceeded what it was designed to handle. The cultural context of 1912 helps explain the hubris. The Edwardian era was the peak of industrial confidence before World War I shattered Victorian and Edwardian optimism. Engineering achievements seemed limitless. Skyscrapers, electricity, automobiles, airplanes, wireless communications, and massive ocean liners all demonstrated human mastery over nature and technical challenges. The Titanic represented the culmination of this progress. The largest moving object ever created by humans, combining every modern convenience and safety feature. Believing it was unsinkable wasn't foolish superstition, but reflected genuine confidence in engineering and technology. The shipping industry competition amplified the hubris. The British White Star Line was competing with German and other British lines for dominance in transatlantic passenger service. The Germans had built large, fast ships. Cunard Line had built the Lusitania and Mauretania, which were faster than White Star's ships. White Star's strategy was to build bigger, more luxurious ships that prioritized comfort over speed. The Olympic-class ships, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, were intended to be the ultimate in size and luxury, making them attractive to wealthy passengers even if they weren't the fastest. This competitive context created pressure to market the ships as superlative in every way, including safety. The Captain Smith factor contributed to the overconfidence. Edward Smith was White Star Line's most senior and experienced captain, with decades of North Atlantic crossings and a reputation for safe, reliable service. He was known as the Millionaire's Captain because wealthy passengers specifically requested to sail with him. Smith had previously commanded the Olympic and had experience navigating through ice. His long career without serious incidents reinforced both his confidence and passengers' trust. The belief that Smith's experience made the voyage safe was reasonable based on his record, but it also meant that his decisions to maintain speed through ice weren't questioned by subordinates who trusted his judgment. The commercial pressure to maintain schedule created incentives to minimize caution. The maiden voyage needed to be impressive, arriving in New York on time or early to demonstrate the ship's capabilities. Slowing down for ice would mean arriving late, giving competitors ammunition to suggest White Star's ships were slow or that the maiden voyage had problems. Bruce Ismay's presence aboard as managing director of White Star Line created additional pressure to make the voyage a commercial success. The degree to which Ismay directly pressured Smith to maintain speed is debated, but his presence certainly created an environment where schedule performance mattered. The lifeboat insufficiency reflected this same overconfidence. The Titanic had 20 lifeboats with capacity for about 1,178 people, less than half the ship's capacity of 2,435 passengers and 892 crew. This wasn't illegal. British Board of Trade regulations based lifeboat requirements on ship tonnage using outdated formulas that didn't account for modern ship capacity. The Titanic exceeded legal requirements for lifeboats, but the regulations were based on the assumption that ships wouldn't sink rapidly, and that lifeboats were mainly for transferring passengers to rescue ships rather than for long-term survival. The unsinkable belief meant that providing lifeboats for everyone seemed unnecessary. Why waste deck space on excessive lifeboats when the ship wouldn't sink anyway? The wireless communications contributed to overconfidence in an unexpected way. The presence of wireless meant that ships could call for help if needed, and other ships could respond. This created a psychological safety net where serious accidents seemed less dangerous, because rescue was always just a radio message away. The Titanic's distress calls did bring rescue ships, but they arrived too late because the ship sank faster than expected, and the nearest ship with wireless didn't receive the messages. The technological safety net failed precisely when it was needed most. The lookout equipment issue exemplifies how overconfidence led to practical shortcuts. The ship's lookouts didn't have binoculars because the binoculars were locked in a cabinet, and the officer with the key had been reassigned before the voyage, leaving the lookouts with only their eyes. This seems like a stunning oversight, and it was, but it reflected the belief that the lookouts wouldn't need to spot icebergs from maximum distance because the ship could handle ice, and because the officers believed they'd see ice in time regardless. The lack of binoculars was a failure enabled by overconfidence that the equipment wasn't critically important. The speed through ice fields was standard practice, but reflected dangerous assumptions. North Atlantic ships in 1912 typically maintained speed through ice regions and relied on lookouts to spot dangers in time to avoid them. This practice worked most of the time, which reinforced it. But it was premised on the assumption that lookouts could see ice in time to turn, which depended on visibility conditions, and on the assumption that if a collision occurred, the ship would survive it, or at least stay afloat long enough for rescue. When these assumptions failed simultaneously, poor visibility, lookouts spotting the berg too late, damage exceeding survivable levels, the standard practice proved inadequate. The post-disaster analysis revealed that hubris had blinded everyone to accumulating risks. Each individual factor, traveling fast through ice, having fewer lifeboats than passengers, maintaining commercial schedule, believing the ship unsinkable, seemed reasonable or at least acceptable in isolation. But the factors accumulated into a disaster waiting to happen. The watertight compartments meant the ship could survive some damage, but not if you were traveling too fast to avoid severe collisions. The wireless meant rescue was available, but not if the ship sank faster than rescue could arrive. The experienced captain meant good decisions would be made, but not if the cultural environment discouraged caution. The broader lesson about technological hubris is that advanced technology can make us safer, but also can create overconfidence that increases risk. The Titanic was technically safer than any previous ship, with better design, better equipment, and better communications. But that technical superiority created cultural overconfidence that negated the safety improvements. The safest ship ever built became one of history's most famous disasters because people believed its safety features made caution unnecessary. Modern societies face similar dynamics. Advanced technology provides genuine safety improvements but can create overconfidence that leads to taking greater risks or paying less attention to dangers. From which country are you watching this? Because technological hubris isn't unique to Edwardian Britain, but appears whenever societies become overconfident in technology's ability to conquer nature or eliminate risks. What examples from your country show overconfidence in technology, leading to disasters that could have been avoided with more caution? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're struck by how reasonable people's mistakes can look from inside a culture of overconfidence, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to explore what happened after the disaster and how these predictions and warnings were remembered. Chapter 5. Remembering the Warnings. How we construct disaster narratives, the way we remember the Titanic disaster, particularly the warnings and predictions surrounding it, reveals how humans construct narratives about tragedies, how we assign meaning to disasters, and how the stories we tell about catastrophes often say more about our psychological needs than about historical accuracy. We emphasize supernatural premonitions and eerie literary predictions because they make the disaster seem fated and mysterious, while downplaying the mundane reality of ignored scientific warnings, because it's more disturbing to acknowledge that disaster was predictable and preventable than to believe it was mysterious and inevitable. Understanding how the Titanic's warnings have been remembered and misremembered provides insight into how societies process tragedy, how we balance accountability with comfort, and why we're often more interested in dramatic stories than in learning practical lessons from disasters. The immediate aftermath of the disaster saw a frantic search for explanations and accountability. The American and British inquiries into the sinking focused on technical failures, safety regulation inadequacies, and specific decisions by Captain Smith and other officers. The inquiries documented the ice warnings that had been received and ignored, the insufficient lifeboats, the speed through ice fields, and the other practical failures that contributed to disaster. These official investigations produced detailed records establishing the facts but also revealing systemic problems in maritime safety regulation and shipboard procedures. The popular narrative that emerged alongside the official investigations was more focused on drama, heroism, and tragedy than on technical failures and regulatory shortcomings. Stories of bravery, the band playing as the ship sank, Captain Smith going down with his ship, Benjamin Guggenheim dressing in evening wear to meet death like a gentleman, dominated public memory. These stories made the disaster meaningful in human terms, but also allowed people to focus on nobility in the face of tragedy rather than on the preventable failures that caused it. The heroic narrative was emotionally satisfying in ways that a narrative about ignored warnings and organizational failures was not. The unsinkable claim became exaggerated in memory. While White Star Line had been relatively careful in their language, popular memory transformed practically unsinkable into claim to be literally unsinkable, making the hubris seem more extreme and the tragedy more dramatically ironic. This exaggeration served narrative purposes. It made the disaster seem like divine punishment for human arrogance, rather than the result of specific organizational failures and bad decisions. The morality tale of hubris punished was more satisfying than the complex reality of systemic failures and competing priorities. The premonition stories proliferated after the disaster as people searched for meaning and pattern in the tragedy. Stories that might have received little attention if the voyage had been successful became significant after the sinking. People who had changed their travel plans for mundane reasons were retroactively remembered as having had premonitions. Dreams and anxieties that would normally be forgotten became prophetic warnings in hindsight. The human tendency to find patterns and meaning in tragedy drove the expansion of premonition narratives beyond what pre-disaster documentation supports. The Morgan Robertson prediction became legendary specifically because it provided a tidy narrative of artistic foresight. Robertson had died in 1915, so he wasn't alive to capitalize on the connection or to explain his story. His novella, which had been relatively obscure, was republished after the disaster and gained fame specifically because of the Titanic parallels. The similarities were emphasized while differences were minimized, creating a narrative of impossible prediction that was more emotionally satisfying than the reality of informed extrapolation. People wanted to believe that the disaster had been foreseen, perhaps because that made it seem less random and more part of some larger pattern or plan. The ignored warnings narrative emerged more slowly, as scholars and historians examined the detailed records from the inquiries and from wireless message logs. The documentation of multiple ice warnings being received but not acted upon became a key element of understanding why the disaster occurred. But this narrative was less emotionally compelling than the premonition and literary prediction stories, because it suggested the disaster was preventable through better procedures rather than inevitable due to fate or hubris. The preventable tragedy narrative is more useful for learning lessons but less satisfying for emotional processing. The class dimensions of the disaster became prominent in popular memory, particularly the narrative that third-class passengers were deliberately kept below decks, while first-class passengers had priority for lifeboats. This narrative has some factual basis. Class certainly affected survival rates, but it's been exaggerated in popular memory and in fictional retellings. The class angle provided a social justice interpretation of the disaster, making it a parable about inequality rather than a story about technological hubris or organizational failure. Different groups emphasize different aspects of the story based on what they wanted the disaster to mean. The Captain Smith narratives reveal how individual accountability gets assigned in disaster stories. Smith was portrayed both as a heroic captain going down with his ship in the finest maritime tradition and as a reckless captain who ignored warnings and drove his ship too fast through dangerous waters. Both narratives have some truth, but they serve different narrative purposes. The heroic narrative provides a noble figure to admire in the face of tragedy. The reckless captain narrative provides someone to blame, satisfying the need for accountability. The reality that Smith was experienced, competent, and following standard practices that proved inadequate is more complex than either narrative allows. The Californian controversy became one of the most contentious aspects of Titanic memory. The ship that had sent the final ice warning was stopped in the ice field and within sight of where the Titanic sank. Officers on the Californian saw distress rockets but didn't respond because their wireless operator was asleep and they didn't realize the seriousness of the situation. Captain Stanley, Lord of the Californian, spent the rest of his life defending himself against accusations that he could have saved Titanic passengers if he'd responded to the rockets. The controversy continues today, revealing how disaster narratives create villains and heroes. From complex situations involving limited information and difficult decisions, the technological determinism in Titanic narratives reflects modern anxieties about technology. Some interpretations present the disaster as inevitable consequence of pushing technology beyond its limits, building ships too big, traveling too fast, trusting too much in modern conveniences. This narrative resonates with contemporary concerns about technological overreach and makes the Titanic a parable about the dangers of excessive faith in technology. But it also potentially obscures the reality that better procedures, better attention to warnings, and better regulations could have prevented disaster even with the same technology. The romance and tragedy focus in popular culture, particularly after James Cameron's 1997 film, has emphasized personal stories and class dynamics, while sometimes minimizing the technical and organizational aspects of the disaster. The film's fictional love story between Jack and Rose made the disaster emotionally accessible to modern audiences, but also shifted focus from the systemic failures and ignored warnings that made the disaster possible. Popular culture's version of the Titanic is about love, loss, and class inequality more than about maritime safety regulations and wireless message prioritization. The conspiracy theories that emerged around the Titanic show how disasters generate alternative narratives when the official story seems unsatisfying. Theories that J.P. Morgan orchestrated the disaster to kill rivals, that the ship that sank was actually the Olympics switched for insurance fraud, that the disaster was an inside job to create support for the Federal Reserve. These theories reflect distrust of official narratives and the belief that major events must have hidden causes. These theories thrive because they provide simpler explanations: deliberate, conspiracy, then complex reality, accumulation of organizational failures and bad decisions. The lesson learning from the disaster was substantial but selective. The regulations on lifeboats, wireless watch, and ice monitoring that emerged from the disaster directly addressed the immediate practical failures. But the broader lessons about organizational culture, hubris, and the importance of heeding warnings have been learned and forgotten repeatedly. Maritime safety improved dramatically, but similar patterns of ignored warnings and overconfidence appear in later disasters from different domains: aviation, nuclear power, finance, public health. The specific lessons are learned, while the general pattern repeats. The cultural memory of the Titanic has shaped how we think about technological disasters generally. The Titanic serves as a reference point and cautionary tale invoked whenever modern technology seems overconfident or when warnings are being ignored. Calling something Titanic implies both massive scale and potential for catastrophic failure. The disaster has become a permanent part of cultural memory, serving as a parable about hubris, technological overconfidence, and the importance of respecting nature's power. Whether this cultural memory actually prevents similar disasters is unclear. We keep referring to the Titanic's lessons while sometimes ignoring warnings in our own time. From which country are you watching this? Because the way societies remember and interpret disasters reveals what they want those disasters to mean and what lessons they're willing or unwilling to learn. How are major disasters from your country's history remembered? And do those memories emphasize the right lessons? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're struck by how disaster narratives evolve to serve different purposes, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to conclude our investigation of the Titanic's warnings, with reflections on what this teaches us about prediction, precaution, and human nature. Our investigation of the predictions and warnings surrounding the Titanic disaster has taken us from supernatural premonitions and last-minute cancellations, through Morgan Robertson's eerily prescient fiction, to the very real and specific ice warnings that were ignored, into the culture of technological hubris that made dismissing warnings seem reasonable, and finally to how we remember and misremember the disaster's warnings. What we've discovered is that the Titanic disaster was simultaneously unpredicted and overpredicted, mystical and mundane, inevitable and preventable, depending on which warnings we examine and how we understand the concept of prediction. The supernatural premonitions and dream warnings represent the human desire to believe we can sense future dangers and that tragedies give advance warning to those spiritually sensitive enough to receive them. Whether these premonitions were genuine precognition, anxiety coincidentally proven right, or post hoc fabrications doesn't ultimately matter as much as what they reveal about how we process tragedy. We want to believe disasters are predictable through some means, whether supernatural or scientific, because if they're predictable, they're potentially preventable. The premonition stories are psychologically comforting, even though they're probably not evidentially sound. The literary predictions of Morgan Robertson and W.T. Stead are less supernatural than they first appear, but more significant than mere coincidence. Robertson wrote an informed extrapolation about where maritime technology and hubris were headed, and real events later matched his prediction, not because he had supernatural foresight, but because his analysis of trends and dangers was accurate. This is perhaps more impressive than supernatural prediction, because it suggests that careful attention to existing patterns and dangers can allow reasonable prediction of future disasters. Robertson's story is a case study in informed risk assessment being dismissed as fiction until the predicted disaster occurs. The real warnings, the 6 ice messages received on April 14, 1912, providing specific information about dangers directly in the Titanic's path, are the genuinely disturbing predictions that were ignored. These weren't vague mystical feelings or literary speculation, but concrete scientific data transmitted via modern technology, specifically to warn about hazards ahead. The disaster happened exactly as these warnings predicted it would. The ship encountered ice in the locations and circumstances that other ships had warned about. The failure wasn't in prediction but in response. The warnings were accurate, specific, and timely, but they were dismissed, not forwarded or not acted upon, because organizational failures and cultural hubris made ignoring them seem acceptable. The culture of technological overconfidence that made ignoring warnings seem reasonable is perhaps the most important context for understanding the disaster. The Titanic wasn't some primitive vessel where the dangers weren't understood. It was the most advanced ship of its era, designed with sophisticated safety features, operated by experienced professionals, and equipped with modern communications. The disaster occurred precisely because all these advantages created confidence that the dangers could be managed with standard procedures and that the ship's engineering could overcome any problems that arose. The warnings were ignored not because people didn't understand the risks, but because they believed the technology made those risks manageable. The way we remember the Titanic's warnings reveals our conflicting desires. We want to believe in supernatural predictions and mystical foresight because that's dramatic and mysterious. But we also want to learn practical lessons about safety and caution. The result is a confused memory that emphasizes premonitions and literary predictions while sometimes downplaying the mundane reality of scientific warnings being ignored due to organizational dysfunction and competing priorities. The supernatural angle makes better stories, but the practical angle contains the actual lessons about how to prevent similar disasters. The distinction between prediction and precaution is crucial. Many of the Titanic predictions are less about foreseeing specific events than about recognizing patterns of risk and danger. Robertson predicted that building ever larger ships and marketing them as unsinkable, while providing inadequate lifeboats, would eventually lead to disaster. That's risk assessment rather than mystical foresight. The ice warnings predicted that the Titanic would encounter ice in specific locations. That's scientific observation rather than supernatural knowledge. The value in both cases comes from taking the predictions seriously enough to take precautionary action, which didn't happen. The organizational failures that allowed warnings to be ignored are remarkably similar to patterns in later disasters. The commercial pressure to prioritize passenger messages over safety warnings mirrors how financial pressures can lead organizations to defer maintenance or ignore safety concerns. The cultural hubris that made slowing down seem unnecessary mirrors how confidence in technology can lead to dismissing warnings about risks. The lack of clear protocols for handling warnings mirrors how organizations fail to establish clear procedures for escalating safety concerns. The Titanic's specific failures have been fixed in maritime safety, but the general patterns appear in other domains. The class dimensions of the disaster and its warnings reveal that whose warnings get heard and who suffers consequences when warnings are ignored is often determined by power and status. The wealthy passengers whose personal telegraph messages took priority over ice warnings didn't suffer disproportionately. Survival rates were actually highest in first class. The third-class passengers and crew who suffered worst had no input into the decisions about speed, route, or response to warnings. This pattern of those making risky decisions being insulated from consequences while those with no decision-making power suffering the results appears across many disasters. The technological paradox is that advances in safety technology can actually increase risk if they create overconfidence that leads to taking greater risks or being less careful. The Titanic was technically the safest ship ever built, with watertight compartments, wireless communications, and sophisticated design. But these safety features created confidence that made people less cautious about speed, less concerned about ice, and less worried about lifeboat capacity. The safest ship became one of history's deadliest disasters because the safety features created a culture of overconfidence. This paradox appears in many domains. Seatbelts making drivers feel safe enough to drive faster, antibiotics creating confidence that led to overuse and resistance, financial innovations creating confidence that led to excessive risk-taking. The regulatory response to the Titanic disaster was substantial and effective in addressing immediate problems. Requirements for sufficient lifeboats, 24-hour wireless watch, international ice patrol monitoring icebergs, and other specific reforms directly address the failures that sank the Titanic. These reforms show that disasters can drive meaningful regulatory improvement when the political will exists. But the broader cultural lessons about hubris, about heeding warnings, and about not letting commercial pressures override safety concerns are harder to institutionalize and easier to forget as time passes and new technologies create new confidence. The modern relevance of the Titanic's ignored warnings is that we face similar situations regularly. Climate. Scientists warning about specific risks that are dismissed due to economic priorities. Public health experts warning about pandemic preparedness that's ignored until crisis hits. Infrastructure engineers warning about maintenance needs that are deferred until catastrophic failure. Financial regulators warning about systemic risks that are dismissed until collapse. The pattern of experts providing specific warnings based on data, those warnings being dismissed due to overconfidence or competing priorities. And then the predicted disaster occurring remains depressingly common. Despite our claimed learning from historical disasters, the question of whether anyone really predicted the Titanic disaster in a meaningful way comes down to what we mean by prediction. If we mean supernatural foreknowledge of a specific future event, then no one predicted it in that sense. If we mean informed extrapolation about where trends and dangers were leading, then yes, Robertson and others predicted that something like the Titanic disaster would eventually happen. If we mean specific scientific warnings about immediate dangers, then absolutely yes, multiple ships explicitly warned about ice in the Titanic's path, and those warnings were accurate and ignored. The disaster was both unpredictable in the mystical sense and over-predicted in the practical sense. The final lesson is about humility. Humility about technology's ability to conquer nature. Humility about our ability to predict specific disasters versus recognizing patterns of risk. And humility about whether we actually learn from history or just tell ourselves we do while repeating similar mistakes in different contexts. The Titanic disaster occurred because people were insufficiently humble about the limits of technology, the power of nature, and the importance of heeding warnings. The disaster is remembered in ways that sometimes perpetuate rather than correct these failures of humility. We prefer mystical explanations and heroic narratives to the mundane reality of organizational failure and ignored warnings. Thank you for joining us on this investigation of the Titanic's predictions and warnings. If you found this exploration of how disasters are predicted, ignored, remembered, and misremembered both fascinating and unsettling, make sure you're subscribed to History Unleashed for more investigations into historical mysteries and uncomfortable truths. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a video, and let us know in the comments what other historical warnings and predictions you'd like us to explore. Until next time, remember that supernatural premonitions make good stories, but scientific warnings save lives. That technological advancement without humility creates new dangers rather than eliminating old ones. That the warnings we ignore are more significant than the warnings we invent after disasters. And that the Titanic's real tragedy wasn't that it was unpredictable, but that it was predicted repeatedly and happened anyway, because warnings that contradict what we want to believe are the easiest warnings to ignore. Stay curious, stay humble, and remember that the most important predictions are the ones we're currently ignoring.